I'm no tech genius, but I knew if I wanted my business to crush it, I needed a website now. Thankfully, Bluehost made it easy. I customized, optimized, and monetized everything exactly how I wanted with AI. In minutes, my site was up. I couldn't believe it. The search engine tools even helped me get more site visitors. Whatever your passion project is, you can set it up with Bluehost. With their 30-day money-back guarantee, what do you got to lose? Head to Bluehost.com. That's BLUEHOST.com to start now.
Imagine you're a business owner relying on a dozen different software programs, each one disconnected, more expensive, and more complicated than the last. It can be incredibly stressful, right? Now, picture Odoo. Odoo brings all the tools your business needs into one simple platform. CRM, accounting, inventory, manufacturing, marketing, HR, and more. All seamlessly connected. Everything works together, giving you the peace of mind that your business is running smoothly from every angle. Odoo's open source applications are user-friendly and designed to scale with your business, saving you time and money. Say goodbye to juggling multiple platforms and hello to efficient, integrated management. Stop wasting resources on complicated systems and make the switch to Odoo today. Visit odoo.com, ODOO.com, and discover how Odoo can simplify and streamline your business operations. Odoo, modern management made simple.
Made popular by Hendrik Verlinden in 1932, Tripel is a strong golden Belgian ale that was eventually adopted by the monks of Westmalle, and like many other Belgian styles, it relies heavily on the use of simple sugar, of which brewers have a variety to choose from. This is the Brülosophy podcast. I'm your host, Marshall Schott, and today I'm joined by contributor Will Lovell to chat about the use of different types of sugar, namely sucrose and invert sugar, when making Belgian Tripel.
This is just a very interesting observation through the years of brewing and brewing Belgian beers, is how really opinionated as brewers we all can get about what types of sugar are the correct thing to use in this style. So I'm very excited to talk about this and the different controversial opinions that each sugar may have behind it. So super excited to talk about this today.
Well, I feel like I have to say out loud now that prior to starting this episode, recording this episode, you and I were just chatting, and I made the comment that brewers seem to have this tendency to overcomplicate seemingly simple things, and I can't help but wonder if the inversion process when it comes to making inverted sugar really has that big of an impact. So, since the time I started brewing, my views on the use of simple sugar in general in brewing have changed quite a bit, based largely on both my own anecdotal experiences as well as several experiments that we have completed. Now, while I've certainly, I don't rely on sugar additions in the majority of my beers. That's just not how I brew. It is something I do for certain styles, Tripel being one of them, and I absolutely look forward to chatting with you about how sucrose compares to invert sugar in this notably strong and tasty Belgian ale. All right, if you're a fan of this show and you'd like to receive a reward for your support, please consider becoming a patron of Brülosophy over at patreon.com/Brülosophy, where you make a small monthly pledge and receive rewards like access to unpublished contributor recipes, unique discounts at YakimaValleyHops.com, and an invite to a live brew day with a Brülosophy contributor. This month, one of our most senior contributors, Steve Thanos, will be hosting the brew day from his Chicagoland brewery. Learn more about all of the rewards we offer for your support over at patreon.com/Brülosophy. And massive shout out to all of our current patrons for helping us to continue producing this content. We could not do it without you. And if you wouldn't mind letting us know what you think about this show by leaving a rating and review in Apple Podcast or wherever it is you listen to podcasts that allow you to do that, we would really appreciate that as well. By doing so, those who have yet to hear about us can more easily find the show. Plus, we really do like reading what y'all think about how we're doing. Feedback is brought to you by Clawhammer Supply, who offer brewers various options for high-quality, reasonably priced electric brewing rigs in various voltages and sizes. I've used their 120-volt system for 5-gallon batches, as well as their 240-volt 10-gallon setup, and both really are awesome. Clawhammer Supply puts the effort into ensuring their systems do exactly as they are intended to do in as efficient a way as possible. And if you're not quite ready to make the jump to electric just yet, they also sell 10 and 20-gallon brew-in-a-bag homebrewing starter kits. Whatever it is you're looking for, do yourself a favor and visit clawhammersupply.com. We are confident you're going to love their stuff just as much as we do. Listener Donald Schneider wrote in with a comment on something that came up in our latest Brew and A episode regarding the probiotic drink known as Good Belly. Donald said, I used to work in biotech for a company where our main product was manufacturing Bacillus subtilis. It's largely harmless, so I don't think it would pose any significant issues there. However, unlike lactobacillus, it is a spore-forming bacteria. If it's allowed to grow until some stressor makes it unhappy, like running out of food, it will form spores that will survive until conditions improve, and then the bacteria will grow from the spores again. These spores are extremely resilient. They can even survive in the vacuum of space, and it takes temperatures in excess of 250 degrees Fahrenheit or 121 degrees Celsius to kill them, which is above the boiling point. I'm not sure what Bacillus subtilis would do in this situation, but if it sporulates during your souring period, those spores will make it into your fermenter and could emerge during fermentation or maybe even post-packaging, causing some really weird issues. What say you, Will?
That's some good BS right there for the Bacillus subtilis. No, that's some good BS right there. No, that's good to know. I'm glad we had somebody that's more of an expert on this topic than we were. I'm very thankful for the person that submitted that question to point that out, because again, we don't need that BS in near our beer. It sounds like, especially if it gets to the spore forming stage. So I think when it comes to Good Belly, I'm just going to have to go look for the capsules next time I'm in the market for a sour beer, or kind of do what I've been doing lately, which is leaning more towards some of the lactic acid producing yeasts that are out there. I've had some pretty good luck with co-pitching USO5 with sour VCA, so I may keep going on that train, and then it keeps some of those nice funky things out of my brewery. So I guess it depends on where you want to go with it, but that doesn't seem like a bad idea to me, to just avoid that BS in the Good Belly altogether.
Oh, Bacillus subtilis, aka BS. Yeah, I'm by no means a microbiologist. I don't even pretend to be one on TV, so I am not going to act like I know more about this than I do. Like you said, Will, I absolutely appreciate when folks like Donald reach out with knowledge like this. Hopefully it helps our listeners just as much as it helps us. I've used Good Belly a few times for my own quick sours, but I tend to like the funkiness that I get from using unmilled grain. It also works with my setup a little bit. I mean, Good Belly is so easy to add. I think it does a great job. There's just something I like about the natural souring that I get from using grain anyways. But either way, in the future, I'm not going to be going with Good Belly if it has BS in it, because two things I don't want are, weird things happening that are unpredictable and that I didn't plan for, but also having those bacteria that stick around in my fermenter and whatnot. I've never been a big fan of having a separate set of sour gear, and I've never had an issue because of my cleaning procedure. If those spores are going to stick, are more resilient, say, than just the bacteria itself, and then they're going to produce that bacteria, I don't want to even deal with that. I don't want to risk it. And so again, Donald, thank you for helping me to better solidify my position that if it has BS in it, I'm staying away from it. So thanks again for the feedback, Donald. If you have show feedback or a correction for something that we've said on the show in the past, you can send it to feedback@brülosophy.com or drop us a note on social media. We'll be right back.
Raise your hand if you want your nails to look perfect all the time. Me too. I'm Sarah Gibson-Tuttle from Olive & June, and this is exactly why we created the Mani system. We wanted to make it possible for everyone everywhere to give themselves a beautiful manicure at home. With our tools and our long-lasting polish, each manicure with our Mani system comes out to just $2. That's right, $2. No more $30, $40, $50 manis that you get at a salon and they take hours. Now you can paint your nails on your time and love them more than ever. And by the way, when people ask, who did your nails? Where did you get them done? You're going to proudly say, I did them myself. Get 20% off your first Mani system with code DIYNail20 at oliveandjune.com/DIYNail20. That's code DIYNail20 for 20% off at oliveandjune.com/DIYNail20.
If you love chilling mysteries, unsolved cases, and a touch of mom-style humor, Moms and Mysteries is the podcast you've been searching for. Hey guys, I'm Mandy.
And I'm Melissa. Join us every Tuesday for Moms and Mysteries, your gateway to gripping, well-researched true crime stories. Each week, we deep dive into a variety of mind-boggling cases as we shed light on everything from heists to whodunits. We're your go-to podcast for mysteries with a motherly touch. Subscribe now to Moms and Mysteries wherever you get your podcasts.
Have you ever thought about adding a port to your kettle but held off because you didn't feel like drilling into your gear or sending it off to have someone else do it? From the makers of the world's fastest counterflow chiller, the Xchillerator, comes the Hangover, the easiest way to add extra ports to your kettle as well as countless other options. Mount a faucet to your keg for easy portable pouring. Set up the perfect whirlpool arm. Hold a heating element in place. All of this and so much more without permanently modifying your gear. Manufactured right here in the United States, the Hangover offers brewers too many convenient solutions to list here. So head over to xchillerator.com today to see what the Hangover can do for you. As every brewer knows, the best beer requires the best hops, which Yakima Valley Hops provides fresh from the source to brewers around the world, carrying everything from classics like Cascade to modern favorites like Galaxy and Mosaic, as well as other ingredients and gear. Yakima Valley Hops has it all. And don't forget to check out their new podcast, The Late Edition, where the YVH crew goes into depth on our favorite plant with industry experts. Head over to YakimaValleyHops.com now to see all they have to offer and subscribe to The Late Edition wherever it is you listen to podcasts. The mash is a necessary step in brewing, as it's during this process that the starches in malted grains are enzymatically converted into sugars, namely maltose, that can be fermented by yeast. While a majority of beers rely on this as the sole source of fermentables, there are a handful of styles where the use of simple sugars is commonplace. Now, it's impossible to talk about this topic without getting into some various perspectives held by brewers, ourselves included. So why don't we start with a little bit of history on the use of sugar in beer first?
So the history of sugar in beer. So beer only exists because of fermentation, which by definition is the process of yeast or potentially bacteria. Hopefully not, but maybe. Keep the BS out of there again. Breaking down carbohydrates and which is basically a bunch of sugars and starches into other substances. So most of the sugars used to make beer come from malted grains, namely barley, maybe some wheat, which is called maltose. And this disaccharide called maltose consists of two glucose molecules joined together and is considered a fairly simple sugar, which is why those yeast can come in there and then kind of break that simple sugar apart down the road and, fart out the alcohol and the CO2.
Well, so here's the deal. We're going to be using some terms probably fairly frequently in this episode, disaccharide and monosaccharide. For those who are unfamiliar with those terms, a disaccharide is just a sugar that's made of two molecules. A monosaccharide is a single molecular sugar. It's a sugar that is just one molecule. So that's going to be important as we get into talking about the inversion process. But let's kind of dig into this history a little bit. I feel like it informs some of our opinions and some of why people view things the way they do in the use of sugar. So historical documentation actually shows that British brewers began using more non-malt simple sugars, mostly due to shortfalls in a barley harvest. This was like in the, I believe, early to mid 19th century. But then on top of that, the British government shifted from taxing taxing malt to taxing beer, which further incentivized brewers to rely more on external sugar sources in their beers because it costs less for them to make. So if you're using these sugars, you can actually you're buying less malt. Sugar is cheaper than the malt back then. And you're boosting the alcohol without contributing much else in terms of beer character, while also spending a little bit less to make that beer, which I just think it's fascinating how, these kind of like governmental decisions really did shape the way we brew and view beer these days.
Right. And if you go back and look at like other British styles like dark mild, and you look at the history of how that beer has been made, and like early on, like somewhere in its history, they used kind of a dark syrup sugar syrup solution to kind of give it that dark character and some of that dark mild. Now, whereas to the more modern examples, we've kind of moved away from that, but it's really cool to see how just the taxation and the different things that went on with barley harvest helped kind of, when you just track dark mild itself, went from like kind of something with a syrup in it, a darker syrup, all the way to more modern examples where you don't really see the syrups anymore. So kind of, again, the history really does inform how people brewed these different styles and how we got to where we are, which is really cool. But now we're shifting towards a kind of a more modern style, because even though Tripel is considered to be and some of these Belgian styles are considered to be, older Trappist styles, they're pretty new. But towards the late 19th and early 20th century, Belgian brewers began to using simple sugars. This doesn't seem to be driven by taxation or anything like that. Rather, they just really viewed it a way to boost the strength of beer without contributing much anything else. Because when you add that sugar, it does a really great job of keeping from getting it too thick. With things like Tripel and Dark Strong, you don't really want that Russian Imperial Stout big body. So they just add sugar, thinned it out a little bit, and now you have these beautiful crushable Belgian styles that happen to be 7 to 10% ABV.
So crushable. That's the truth, though. And, as an aside, people will sit and say, well, yeah, it makes sense that sugar in its simplest form, I mean, sucrose is a really simple sugar. You throw some yeast at it in a sugar solution with water, and it's going to ferment no matter what. Well, we've proven that over and over again these days with the popularity of hard seltzer. That's basically what it is. I have friends who make hard seltzers on the regular, and all they're doing is boiling some sugar and water to get to their specific OG, throwing in yeast, and the type of yeast you use will matter. I'd be fascinated to see what, a hard seltzer fermented with, say, a Belgian, a classic Belgian Westmalle strain or something would taste like. Would it have those characteristic phenols and esters that we're used to in beer, or is that really a function of the malt and everything else in beer? Who knows? But the reality is, I'm sure people have been doing this for a long time. I don't even know if there's a name for just fermented sugar water other than, hard seltzer, aka White Claw. But it is absolutely a very simple way to make a boozy drink. And so the thought to, hey, you know what? Why don't we just add more of this sugar to this beer that we want to be crisp and drinkable but strong and also pale to boost it up? And lo and behold, it works really well. So the other thing to note, though, is that the increased use of these sugars occurred around the same time that Belgium's beet sugar industry was taking off. So they had ample access to it. And I'm sure the beet sugar industry was pretty gung-ho about the fact that these brewers were not hiding, the fact that they were using beet sugar in their beers. I think it's kind of interesting.
Right. And again, sugar is not just for Belgians or historic English styles. Like lots of things, like even American light lager, they're using like rice solid syrup, and then corn syrup in some cases, high ABV styles like double IPA. That's, again, it's a really great way to boost your alcohol without having to, get that really thick body that you may not be desirable in a hoppy style. So sugar, even though we have kind of a weird relationship with it because it's not in the Reinheitsgebot, which we like to say anytime that we can because it's just fun to say Reinheitsgebot. It's not in that purity law. So there's a lot of controversy around it, especially amongst traditional German brewers. But, in the rest of the world and somewhat in America, we've had a weird relationship with sugar, I think, in brewing. I see there's a lot of tension there between some brewers and depending on what they like to do. But, again, sugar has a lot of places, a big place in a lot of spots where, again, double IPA, American light lager, American lager, just a great way to boost the ABV without necessarily boosting the body of the beer to keep it crushable.
Yeah. And, I think it goes without saying that at least for maybe some of us older brewers who have kind of been in the game a little bit longer, that for me, it would be original, because I no longer feel this way, but my original perspectives of using sugar in beer were really driven by the commonly discussed idea that, big beer, BMC, Bud Miller Coors, they were using, cheaper sources of fermentable sugars in their beers. And, it wasn't that it made beer bad. It was that these guys that we don't like were using it, and that's why it's bad, and we're going to be different. And I just think that's such a foolish way to make decisions. I'm glad I came around. But like I said earlier, part of the reason that I came around was I actually tried it out, and it just didn't do the things that people swore it would do. And how many times have we said that about other variables in brewing as well? So, like you mentioned earlier, if I'm making a double IPA, I have made several batches of double IPA with no simple sugar additions, just all malt. And yeah, they're good, but they do tend to have this viscosity that I'm not the biggest fan of for a hoppy style like that. They have this richness from that malt flavor, because the more malt you use, the more flavorful that malt that beer is going to be in terms of maltiness, the more body it's going to have, regardless of how low you mash or what strain of yeast you ferment with. You add sugar, it's going to be crisper, it's going to be easier to drink, in my opinion. And some would argue that for a hoppy style like that, it's really going to help to accentuate that hop character more as well. So that's kind of down in more modern times, talking about sugar usage. Obviously, it's still going to get used in styles like Belgian Triple and whatnot. I've never made a Belgian Triple without using some form of a simple sugar to make it, because that's just kind of the classic way of doing it. So now let's focus a little bit more on different types of sugar in brewing. We don't want to get too deep into every single type. There are things like dextrose, which is apparently it's chemically identical to glucose. It usually comes from corn. It can come from rice. There's things like honey and turbinado sugar, which are fermentable as well in their own ways. And people believe that they're going to impart some noticeable flavor in beer. But really what we're going to focus on in this episode, just because it's our focus of the experiment, are maltose, sucrose, and what invert sugar is, and we'll get into breaking down, no pun intended, exactly how that's made and what it is. But let's start with maltose first. So again, we've said it before, but maltose is the primary fermentable sugar that comes from the types of grains that we use, namely malted barley, in beer. And we're going to refrain from getting too deep into the weeds on what exactly maltose is and the fermentable properties of it. But just to keep it, scientific enough, in order for yeast to consume maltose, it does first have to actively transport inside the cell, which is what's referred to as a rate limiting factor, meaning it slows down the overall speed of the fermentation process. When people say that maltose is a little bit more difficult for yeast to ferment than, say, something like sucrose or dextrose, that's really what they're referring to, because sucrose, in comparison to maltose, again, sucrose is just table sugar, is a disaccharide that's made up of one glucose and one fructose molecule that's more readily fermentable by yeast than maltose. Why is that? Because the yeast use what's called invertase, which is secreted outside of the cell rather than having the yeast go inside the cell. And it helps to rapidly break down this sucrose into its component monosaccharides that are more easily metabolized by yeast. So theoretically speaking, if you're just looking at maltose and sucrose should ferment more easily by most brewers' yeast than maltose. So by adding that to beer, what we're doing is making it more fermentable, arguably, and not even just with all of the conditional stuff like, it's going to, you're not going to have as much malt flavor. It's going to be thinner and easier to drink, all that. It should actually just be more easy for that yeast to ferment anyways, which some claim can reduce the production of off flavors as well.
Now, one thing I think is worth noting here, typically speaking, when you're using sugar, even in Belgian styles that depend a lot on sugar, you don't typically go much over 20%.
Right.
And when you start going too far above that, you do get into kind of must range, which is just a sugar water mixture. And when you do that, you're starting to get into spots where the yeast will need some additional nutrients maybe to get the job done. Because in making White Claw clones, you're making your hard seltzer where it's just all sugar. You do definitely need some nutrient in there to help those yeasts get the job done, because again, the malt and the stuff that we use in the mash gives us a lot of nutrients for those yeast, whereas just sugar does not do that. But so, sugar's kind of like candy for them. And then, the maltose and from the malt is more like a hearty meal. And so it may take them a little longer to eat, but it does have more of the nutrients that they need to get the job done. It's not just, snorting the white line in the bathroom and just getting going off real fast. So, but then, we have this interesting thing, which is kind of what we're talking about today, which is invert sugar, where you're actually, which some people claim, especially those in the confectionery world, that invert sugar is sweeter than just normal table sugar. But essentially, you're taking table sugar water and you're adding an acid or potentially an alkali material, to split into its components of glucose and fructose. So it's a really cool kind of thing that you can do where you can just heat water, table sugar, add a little bit of acid or maybe lye if you so desire to have that on hand. And then, again, you wind up with not just glucose, but you have a sum that is greater than its parts with glucose and fructose. They're along with that acid or basic catalyst to get involved. So pretty cool little thing.
Yeah, well, and the neat thing about invert sugar, first off, invert sugar. My understanding is that if you're going through the inversion process, it requires the use of water because you have to dissolve the sugar in it, and like you said, either an acid or an alkali catalyst that is going to, through the heating process with that catalyst, split that disaccharide into its component monosaccharides. Well, that because of the addition of the water, invert sugar, I believe, is always in the form of a syrup. And so, or a liquid at the very least. To me, the invert sugars I've used have always been much more syrupy than they have just kind of thin liquid. And so that's one thing. What I find fascinating, you mentioned it already, is this idea that invert sugar is perceptibly sweeter, at least in the confectionery world of the experts from there. They claim that it tastes sweeter than sucrose on its own. That being said, sucrose is the same exact thing. It's just the compound version of what the two separate monosaccharides and invert sugar are. So it's fascinating to me, just the chemistry behind that one would taste sweeter than the other, even though it's just the like you said, sucrose is kind of the gestalt of invert sugar, of the two molecules that are in invert sugar. So I don't know why that would be, but it's fascinating. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be more fermentable. Most people will speak of sucrose as being nearly 100% fermentable. Again, the way that I think about it is that invert sugar is just a bit easier, ostensibly at least, for yeast to metabolize than sucrose, because the yeast doesn't have to go through the process of splitting those molecules before it metabolizes the fructose and the glucose. It's already split ahead of time. So
yeah, and then we kind of touched on some other fermentable brewing sugars like dextrose, which typically comes from corn and is pretty similar to glucose. We talked briefly about honey, which is kind of a more complicated compound because there's more in honey than just sugar, but it's mostly glucose and fructose and some other things. And then I think turbinado is kind of one of the more interesting ones out there because it's just cane sugar that hasn't been processed, so there's still some of that actual molasses left on the crystal. And it is a brown sugar, not to be confused with like American store-bought brown sugar where they literally add molasses back to it, which has its own place, but it is very different than turbinado. And so those are all kind of fun for things to ferment with and all kind of bring their own different things to the party. But, why don't we talk a little bit about Belgian Tripel? Because that's what we're here really to talk about. Is let's take this beautiful thing of invert sugar where we've introduced a catalyst, made some fructose and glucose living in harmony together, and let's add it to this historical style that it's actually kind of the new kid on the block when it comes to Trappist a little bit. But, because it was made, in the 1930s? That's when Tripel was made, and it was by Hendrik Verlinden of the Drelinden Brewery, and he started labeling it as Trappist, and then eventually kind of let the Trappist breweries that we now know as the monasteries take over that label a little on down the road, which is pretty cool of them. Yeah,
actually, I read some. It's kind of tough because, back then, I mean, even though it was the 1930s, like that's not that long ago, but apparently there was some legal issues that Verlinden had with Westmalle when Westmalle started making their version of Tripel. They actually made a beer called Super Beer, which I think is great, in 1934. So just 2 years after Verlinden introduced his, they weren't calling it Tripel at the time, I don't believe, or Verlinden wasn't, but when he introduced what ultimately became Tripel. And then it wasn't until 1956 that Westmalle was like, all right, we'll refine our recipe, we'll do our own thing. And then they created I believe it's basically the same recipe that you can go and get from Westmalle today. Their very popular Tripel, which I find to be quite delicious. But man, wouldn't you love to just be able to have a pint of that original Verlinden, Dre Linden version of this triple, the very original one? I think it's awesome. One thing though that Hendrik Verlinden did, and that was adopted by, and I think it was because it was common in Belgian breweries anyways, was use a good amount of simple sugars to produce this strong pale, it's a pale, strong ale, but it kind of has some characteristics of lagers, which, as you can imagine, they were doing. I believe Hendrik's main motivation was to kind of compete with the popularity of the pale lagers that were just blowing up at the time. And his way of doing that was to keep it in the Belgian world, so it still had that nice Belgian fermentation character, but it had the crispness and the color of a nice pale lager, but the strength of something much bigger. And to me, it's just a fascinating history that, and then, the Trappist monks ended up adopting it. And now if you are talking about a triple, most people will associate it with, Belgian monasteries and those Trappist monks brewing this beer as a form of sustenance, but also as a way to catch a pretty killer buzz without consuming too much volume.
And I've had a lot of triples, and I've had some that I consider to be better than Westmalle in my opinion. But I do think when you say triple, Westmalle should be the first brewery that comes to your mind. Like, it should be just like the thing that rolls off your tongue, because they make a really beautiful example of the style. And I remember sitting at their cafe across the street from their brewery next to the monastery and having Westmalle just kind of right there. And it was so delicious. So good. The BJCP describes this style as a strong, pale, somewhat spicy Belgian ale with a pleasant, rounded malt flavor, firm bitterness, and dry finish. Probably a dry finish because we're adding a whole bunch of sugar. It's quite aromatic with spicy, fruity, and light alcohol notes combining with the supportive, clean malt character produce a surprisingly drinkable beverage considering the high alcohol content. And it is typically made with 10 to 20% of a sugar adjunct, which is a pretty large amount, I would think, according to most American brewers today. So again, but that dry finish, again, this 20% of sugar really drives that dry finish to it. It keeps it to where you can have a nice 7, 8, 9% ABV beer and keep it kind of, still manageable. And it feels way too crushable. Like, with the really good ones are way too crushable for what they are. And suddenly you're 3 glasses in and don't know how you got there.
Or how to get home. Yeah. The a couple of things on the style, and I know you're very familiar with the style, probably more so than I am, in part because you've spent time in Belgium. That's one country I've yet to visit that I cannot wait to get to in the future. But a couple of things I'm curious about. First off, you had mentioned, I don't know if we were on air yet or not, but you had mentioned that Belgians, it's not like they're the ones who are sitting there going, well, we've got to use, invert sugar or candy syrup or this type of specialty sugar. They basically were using whatever would ferment out and get out of the way, right? It's not like they necessarily, I'm sure there were some who were geeking out about it, but really their thing was, we just want to create this dry crushable, beer. Give us something that ferments and we'll use it, right?
Yeah. My impression, at least my personal impression, is that most Belgian breweries don't really. It's more of like, what do we have? Obviously, they had a lot of beet sugar at one point in time because that industry blew up. And so there is some tradition using like beet kind of candy sugar kind of stuff. But really, it's like, what do we have that's fermentable, that's not real expensive, that we can throw in here? I can't imagine that a lot of these big breweries are spending buku bucks on candy syrup from wherever, because again, they got to turn around and they got to make a buck on it. And these high ABV beers that have to age for 3 to 6 months before they become drinkable aren't, a quick turnaround. So they're just really trying to get something that's fermentable to get in there and do the job. And especially with these like, triple and then even Potter's beer, these lighter kind of styles, it's really about just getting something in there that's pale and that'll get the job done. And I think we put a lot of thought and energy into it as brewers because that's what we do. But I feel like we kind of overblow some of it to some degree because again, these guys are really just trying to get something formidable in there. So, I mean, I'm sure as we go through the experiment and go through some of the reader comments, we'll see kind of the heart behind it, that we all have lots of very strong opinions and feelings around sugar, where I don't know that the Belgian brewers themselves actually have as high or strong opinions about it. They're just trying to get something formidable in there.
They're looking over here at us being like, chill out, man. Just use what you got, right? Last question I have just about the style, and this is sort of an aside, has nothing to do with sugar, but I have friends who, when they make Tripel, they add a little dose of coriander, and that is not something that I've ever done. I don't mind those beers. I don't really see the point in adding it though, because of how characterful Tripel is on its own. But what, your experience in Belgium, I've always been curious about that. Is it a thing that some of the traditional breweries are doing, or is that kind of an American thing just to add more, quote, spice character to this style?
Well, I think there's a tendency for us as Americans to get this idea of what a style is, and then we kind of like go caricature with it.
Yeah.
Like we kind of overemphasize things. And I think coriander is like a piece of that, right? Where we add coriander because we know that there's this spicy note, and we can get kind of that same similar thing with coriander every time, but it kind of overemphasizes that. Really, where all that spicy and even some of the fruity components are coming from, or as some of the esters and phenols that the yeast that you're kicking off with. And so really the lever you should be focusing on is what yeast you're using, potentially pitch rates, and then also really importantly, like what temperatures are you doing it at? Because like you can drive those Belgian yeasts up pretty hot, and they will kick off some really fun, funky things, including I've gotten some weird like peppery stuff whenever I've used the Westmalle strain. What is that? Imperial Triple Double when I went really warm with it. So I usually start my fermentation kind of a little bit cooler just to keep from having nasty blow offs. But pretty soon into it, I'm trying to get that temperature up even into the 70 something Fahrenheit, just to get it a little warmer, because I like playing with that lever, and sometimes you hit it and it's a home run because you nailed it with your yeast fermentation profile, and sometimes you didn't quite nail it as good as you did the last time, but it's definitely that yeast pitch rate and those fermentation temperatures and kind of playing with those levers is more where that spicy, fruity, and some of those esters and phenols should come from, not from coriander, in my opinion. And I don't think they would use coriander in Belgium in most of their beers. Maybe somebody out there does. Belgium's a great country, and there's somebody in that country doing something funky with coriander, I'm sure. But but not traditionally.
Yeah, well, wit beer. Wit beer is or coriander, and I believe bitter orange peel is kind of the classic adjuncts that you're going to add to wit beer. But yeah, and I could kind of, again, I sort of get why somebody here would think, let's add a little coriander. That'll spice things up a bit. Yeah, it does. And it's not bad, but when I have a good Tripel, it is basically a strong, relatively really strong pale lager, but with Belgian ale fermentation character, and it's a very pleasing beer to sip on for me. There's just something special about it. So yeah, I've never made one with coriander. The only thing I've ever made with coriander is a wit beer, and I'm not a huge fan of that style anyway. So you can imagine how little coriander I've used. I've always just been interested in that decision, I guess, upon the American brewers here seem to be making more so than traditional, Trappist brewers. So, well, when I started brewing over 20 years ago, and I really, up until about 10 years ago or so is when this ended, there was a popular idea that was held by most brewers that using table sugar or sucrose in beer would result in this notable apple-like off flavor, or cider, some people would say. So most people used either dextrose or invert sugar, candy syrup being a very popular option. Well, since then, many of us have found those claims to be completely untrue, or at least in our anecdotal experiences, it doesn't seem to add up. And several experiments also seem to back this up. But does a beer made with sucrose taste different than one made with invert sugar? Well, that's exactly what you aim to find out in a recent experiment. We'll be digging into those results when we're back from this break.
We all know that designing recipes is really fun, and doing it well is so much easier with good software. We at Brülosophy recently made the switch to Brewfather, and honestly, y'all, we could not be happier. Brewfather utilizes the latest technology to bring you the most robust cloud-based recipe design software that can be accessed anywhere, on your phone, tablet, desktop, and even offline. It also works seamlessly with numerous third-party devices to make it easier to monitor every step of your brew. I know change can be difficult, but trust me when I say you need to go to brewfather.app today to try it out for yourself. That's brewfather.app.
There's no denying that stainless steel is the best material for brewing equipment, and Delta Brewing Systems offers some of the lowest prices on high-quality stainless gear, like the Firm Tank, which in addition to holding 8 gallons or 30 liters of wort, comes with a domed lid to even further reduce the chances of a messy blow-off. Plus, it can hold up to 4 psi of pressure for closed transfers. Delta Brewing Systems also has their own line of brew kettles, as well as one of the lowest-priced all-in-one electric brewing systems out there, and their prices are shockingly low. If you're in the market for legit stainless gear that won't break the bank, do yourself a favor and head over to deltabrewingsystems.com today. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't among the many lemmings who drank the table sugar leads to cider flavors Kool-Aid, but that all changed when I set my fears aside and actually tried it out for myself. Lo and behold, no issues whatsoever. Still, while I've yet to get any noticeable off flavors in beers that I've brewed with sucrose, it seems entirely possible to me that different sugars would contribute unique characteristics to beer. Will, you recently compared a couple Belgian triples that you made with either sucrose or invert sugar. Why don't you tell us about that?
Oh man, I can totally relate to being kind of the sugar zealot once upon a time and then having kind of a reformation through the years. I can totally relate to that. So anyways, the whole idea here is we're going to start off we're going to make a triple to compare sucrose to invert sugar. So invert sugar takes a little bit of time to make, so we had to start there. And so to make invert sugar, I did this the night before because again, it's a process in and of itself. So I dissolved 3 pounds or 1.36 kilograms of table sugar, plus 1.3 ounces or 36 grams of citric acid into 2.7 cups or 473 milliliters of water. Wow, look at all those metrics. If you want to go on the website, I do a little bit of a step-by-step if you look up this article. And just to note, in the actual brew day, the amount of table sugar used for the invert sugar is the exact same amount that I used in the batch where I used just plain table sugar for the beer. So it's 3 pounds both ways. So
I think that's an important note, that because there would be some who look and say, well, how, if you used more sugar to make your invert or you use less, then of course it's going to be different. Yada. No, the idea was if we use the same exact amount of sucrose, one goes in dry, the other one gets made into invert sugar. You're not losing the sucrose in that process. All you're doing is evaporating off some water. I mean, arguably that invert sugar would be a more dilute form of sugar compared to the sucrose. But one of the things I'm curious about is you obviously tasted that invert syrup. Was it perceptibly sweeter than, your regular granulated table sugar, or did they taste about the same?
So I'm going to go through the process and then I'll talk about after I cooled it off a little bit. So we heated the solution and you have to keep stirring this until it reaches kind of a point where it boils. And then once it boils, you stop stirring. Once boiling is over, stop stirring. Do not stir anymore. Basically what you do at this point is you can take a brush with a little bit of water and you can hit that and then run it around the rim of your pot just to kind of keep the sugar from sticking to the side of your pot basically. And then once it reaches to a temperature of about 236 Fahrenheit or 113 C, the solution will become like clear, like really clear. And then you can remove it from the heat and cool it. Now, if you want to go with a darker invert sugar solution, you can take it above that. There's some really cool charts out there online. I'm sorry I don't have any of them written down right now. But if you want darker syrups, which is what some people want to do, especially for those British styles we talked about earlier, you can take it a little further and it will keep, those Maillard reactions will keep going and it will get to be a darker color and consistency. And after I let it cool overnight and tasted it, I would say that it does, at least anecdotally, I didn't just like do a pint glass of invert sugar and then a pint glass of sugar side by side, because that would just be really weird. But at least anecdotally, it did taste very sweet. very sweet, maybe even sweeter than just putting some granulated sugar in your mouth. So to answer your question earlier that I took 5 minutes to talk about around to get to, I do think that it did taste sweeter, at least in my opinion. But I didn't do blind triangle tests with granulated sugar versus invert syrup, because that would be easy to tell based off of texture alone. So,
well, here's the thing. So I regularly make my own simple syrup. It's a 1-to-1 ratio, right? 1 cup of table sugar to 1 cup of water. You bring it just up to a boil, let it cool, and it's barely a syrup, but we pour it into a bottle and then we can use that for cocktails. That's the only thing we use it for. I love Gin Fizz and Tom Collins, and those require a little bit of simple sugar. They don't require it, but I like it in there. I don't necessarily think that simple syrup tastes much sweeter than the dry sucrose or table sugar when I put it on my tongue. I do think they present differently, and I guess I could sort of see how that might muck with perceptions a little bit, that, oh God, the way that this, the syrup kind of covers my entire tongue versus that little spot that granulated sugar might get on. I don't know. But I've also never made my own invert syrup, my own invert sugar. And I'm kind of curious now to try. I've got citric acid in my freezer. Just add a little bit, kind of follow your recipe, and use that in my cocktails. I wonder if I would have to use as much if it is perceptibly sweeter. You know what I mean? I could reduce my calorie intake.
Well, and that's kind of the whole impetus in the confectionery world, right? Is that you now have this sugar that is much sweeter, so maybe you don't have to add quite as much.
Yeah.
And then also it's a syrup, so it's more easy to integrate than sugar granules into some of these mixtures for them. So I think there's a lot of really practical uses for invert sugar, especially in confectionery and then also potentially even in beer. But again, it's one of those things. It's not hard. It does take a little bit of time. So, just keep that in mind. And then when you're done, it's piping hot sugar solution that would, scald scald every bit of you. So definitely let it cool off before you do anything with it. But it is a pretty cool thing. So I let it sit in the fridge overnight, and then the next morning, lo and behold, I had this very thick, pretty viscous, syrup solution, if you want to call it that. For the recipe for my actual Belgian triple, I did 2 5-gallon batches. It was 73% Tex Malt Llano Pilsner Malt, 5% Tex Malt Denton County Wheat Malt, and then 2% aromatic malt. And then again, the variable was I either used 20% of my grain bill was either sucrose, table sugar, or the invert syrup that I made.
Oh, that sounds good to me. I mean, so when you added them, at what point you added them about 10 minutes left in the boil, right? Is that?
That's kind of typical, because I wanted to make sure it had enough time to really, because again, the table sugar was still crystal, right? So you wanted to have enough time left in your boil to where it can actually dissolve and, become a pretty, homogeneous solution inside of your wort. And then also with the invert sugar, I believe kind of what I did there too is I poured in there a little bit at a time, but then I also kind of opened up the valve on my kettle and got some hot wort in there to kind of swish around in the pan so I could get all of it out of there. Cause I kind of want to get all of it in there. It's not like, again, the crystal was actually kind of easier to add. You want to take your time so it doesn't float all the way to the bottom and start scorching on your brew kettle. But the invert sugar was, again, cause it's so viscous and it was a little bit cold, even though I brought it out at the beginning of the brew day to kind of let it warm up. It was still pretty viscous, a little cold, and because I left it in the fridge overnight. And so when you're pouring it in there, you got to put a little something warm. So I opened up the valve on my Delta All-in-One to get a little bit of wort in there, swirl it around, dumped it in, and that kind of helped make sure I got at least as much as I could out of that pan that I was using to create the sugar and the syrup. So.
Yeah. So at this point, though, these beers are, these batches, I should say, are identical with one exception. One has granulated table sugar added, whereas the other one has this invert sugar. So carry on with your brew day. Let us know more about how this went.
Right. So again, we added the sugar at about 10 minutes left, but for the mash, to go way back in time to the mash, mashed both at around 149, 150 Fahrenheit or 66 C for 60 minutes. When the mash was complete, I removed the grains and proceeded to boil the worts for 60 minutes. I used 56 grams of Willamette at 60 minutes. Again, 10 minutes left in the boil. I added the sugar or the invert syrup. And then with 5 minutes left, I added 28 grams of SOTS. And then after the boil, I chilled the worts and took some refractometer measurements, and I wound up with 1067 OG for my sucrose. And then my invert sugar hit about 1066 OG, which is pretty close.
I mean, that is it could just be variation, very minor variation between your, different batches and the gear that you're using, whatever, even though everything is identical. That is not a big thing for me. And I think what's more important is where, is there going to be an impact on attenuation based on the different types of sugar? Again, I mentioned it earlier. Sucrose is said to be basically 100% fermentable. Invert sugar should be even more easily fermentable by brewer's yeast. So you wouldn't expect to see much of a difference in fermentation, though maybe. But this 1 point, specific gravity difference between sucrose and invert sugar, I don't know if I would say, I would be terribly confident in claiming that that's because of the sugar, but maybe something else.
I mean, you do technically add water to your sugar solution, right? So it is possible that there is some of that, but you're also bringing it to a boil for some amount of time, getting up to a pretty warm temperature. So I'm not sure how much of that water liquid stays around. And even if it does, I'm impressed that 2 cups of water would only affect it 0.001 gravity reading. So I'm with you. I don't think it could be any number of things. Either way, like, to me, that's pretty doggone close. And when you look at the bricks conversion, because it was like a 16.4 bricks versus 16.2 bricks, like, to get them within 0.2 bricks is pretty stupid close for those of you familiar with that system. So I'm pretty happy with that anytime I can come out with one of these experiments and get it that close. So I then went ahead and pitched a single pouch of Imperial Yeast B48 Triple Double. Westmalle is my favorite yeast strain for triples and anything Trappist, and so I will use triple double or some variant of that anytime to get that Westmalle strain into these beers, because I love what it does. And then I did ferment the beers in a controlled. I think I actually had my glycol system there, so I think I started off a little cooler, but eventually raised it all the way up to 72 degrees Fahrenheit to kind of, again, pull on some of those temperature levers, dry out that attenuation. And apparently we dried it out pretty well, because the final gravities for the sucrose was 1.003, and then the final gravity for the invert sugar was 1.002. So we really dried these things out, and they kind of stayed on course with being about 0.001 gravity reading away from one another. Yeah.
And so, if you were looking just specifically at attenuation, that's pretty much identical attenuation, and so I'm not, again, even less worried about the fact that they started 1 OG a point apart. Both of these beers were just hovering right around that 8.4% ABV mark, which, again, this is a triple. It's supposed to be strong, and boy, howdy did it get there.
Exactly. And I think these, when you do the math on that, I think they both wound up to being about 8.3, 8.4%, somewhere in that ballpark. Yeah. So they were plenty boozy, but again, they were really crisp, really dry finish. But we'll get to that here in just a second. But at this point, beers were pressure transferred into CO2 purge kegs, placed a kegerator where they're allowed to condition for a month before they were ready for evaluation. As far as just looking at the beers, objective, observations, when you look at the beers, I pulled up the picture on the website. They looked pretty much the same in the pictures on the website, and both of them have beautiful white frothy head. Both of them were maybe not as clear as I'd like them to be. I didn't use any kind of finings or anything, but they're not hazy by any stretch of the imagination, and they're just kind of this nice golden straw kind of color with a moderate phase, and again that nice cap of foam on top really just kind of says everything you need to know about a triple. Yeah. No, they look great. I mean, I would drink the hell out of that beer right now. It sounds delicious. It looks great. And I guess this is the part where we get, when we do these experiments, obviously we're drinking these beers before we're serving them to participants. We're not that crazy as we might be. And one of the things that we do is our own set of semi-blind triangle tests. It's just something that we do to see, as completely unblinded, fully aware of what the variable is, what the beer is.
we're the brewer, we do our own set of triangle tests just to see where we're at. Can we tell them apart, as biased as we are in this? And we usually do 5, if not more, sets of triangle tests where somebody else serves us the beers. We're unaware of which one's the unique sample, yada, yada. In this case, you did 5 triangle tests. Tell us about your experience. I want to know not only about the triangle test, but also what your thoughts were, maybe even going into the triangle test, having sampled both of these beers.
So, I did the triangle tests, but beforehand, you're right. We do drink them. We do have at them, have a little bit of a taste here and there. Most of the time when I'm tasting it beforehand, I'm just trying to make sure there's nothing funky going on, like a bad fermentation or maybe an infection or dirty beer line, something like that. I like to make sure all that stuff tastes right. But to me, the one with the invert sugar, as advertised by all of our confectionery friends, was a touch sweeter. And then when I went to go do my triangle test, I got 5 out of 5. And really, that the Sucrose beer to me just had a drier finish, while the invert sugar beer was just a touch sweeter. And they were both really delicious. And to me, I kind of preferred the drier finish of the Sucrose beer. But if you ask my wife, she preferred the other one. She wanted the invert sugar with that slightly sweeter finish on it. But both were dry. But again, there's just this element of sweetness on the invert sugar that just unless you were having them kind of right there next to each other, you probably wouldn't have noticed very much, but it was definitely there, which is why I went 5 for 5 on my own triangle tests.
Yeah. It's interesting. We were talking about how this idea that invert sugar is perceptibly sweeter than granulated table sugar. I wonder if the impression of dryness, I like to use that term, the impression of, because it may very well be. I mean, these beers were, actually the invert sugar beer was arguably drier by one specific gravity point, if we're looking at objective data, was actually drier than the Sucrose beer, but you perceived the Sucrose beer as being perceptibly more dry. And I wonder if that's not because of this idea that invert syrup is perceptibly sweeter than table sugar. And maybe it just left that impression of sweetness that, subjectively you and I would agree is not as good as that less sweet flavor beer. But there are going to be people out there who do like it more. To me, it's fascinating. And this is just, this is just you, Mr. Biased, one person doing these triangle tests, but you're already right out the gate able to tell a difference between this. I think it's pretty fascinating.
Yeah, especially since I'm the guy that I'm not as bad as Martin. Martin's the most snake bit guy in his own personal triangle test, but I'm a very close second to Martin. That's all I'm saying. Very close second. But anyways, who cares what I think? I'm so biased. I'm just the idiot guy that brewed the thing. But I did go out and serve it to 22 people. And if you were going to serve this to 22 people, you would expect 12 people to need to get it right to have a significant result, which, lo and behold, we got exactly that. 55% of the tasters, all 12 of them that we needed, came back and could tell the difference between these beers, and it was a significant result, which is fantastic.
It's also just insanely interesting to me. Now, there are going to be people out there who say, oh, it always happens, no matter what experiment we put out there, and this isn't just us. This happens with any sort of, statistical analysis that, but you were right on the money. Maybe it's not as, stats are stats. And so we have these cutoffs for a reason. And so I'm comfortable saying that, given how precise your brewing process is and how similar these beers were brewed next to each other, that the reason that a significant number of people, as it were able to perceive a difference between these beers, that reason is likely can be chalked up to the difference in the one thing that you did differently, which is use different types of sugar. And I think that's fascinating. Plus the fact that it aligns with your personal impressions just adds a little bit more oomph to that data. Now, when we have a significant result, I'm not a big fan of this. I say that often, but we do ask tasters to rate which one they thought was better or what their preference was. Now, all tasters rate their preference no matter what. It's just that the people who got the triangle test wrong, we have them compare the two similar beers and rate which one they like more. And there's also the option to say that they don't detect really much of a difference, or that they don't really have a preference, even though they taste a difference. But the people who were accurate on the triangle test will be asked to compare just the two colored cups that are different. And then we ask them to kind of focus on those and pick the one that they like the most. So here's that data. A total of 3 tasters out of the 12 who got the triangle test right reported preferring the beer made with sucrose. So those are your people, the people that agree with you there, Will. 5 people said that they like the beer made with invert sugar more, and 4 said that they really didn't have much of a preference despite noticing that there was a difference between these beers. I have to imagine the difference was not terribly vast, but they did perceive a difference and still felt like they were both good enough or bad enough to not really pick a preference. So you are in the minority here in preferring the one made with sucrose. I have a feeling I'd probably be right there with you, but I don't know. I didn't taste these beers. What do you think about that preference data?
Preference data is preference data. So I think they're both really good beers. Like, I had no problem drinking either one of them. That didn't bother me that one was slightly sweeter than the other one. It wasn't like it was a sweet beer. It was just ever so slightly sweeter. It's not like, putting raw sugar in your mouth versus, water. It wasn't that drastic of a, stark of a contrast. They were very, very similar. So for me, and then, I talked to a few of these tasters. My buddy Tim, who also is kind of a Belgian, geek and likes triples and dark strongs and all that stuff, he preferred the one made with sucrose. If you talk to my wife, she preferred the one made with the invert sugar. Again, preference is preference. And so, I'm going to just keep probably making it with table sugar, though, because that's what I preferred, and it's way easier than making invert sugar. But as an aside, I have to point this out, because I don't know if this is a common thing for me, but I really love giving the preference data questions, because what happens is we have a red, green, and a blue cup, right? And so 2 of those cups are the same, 1 is different. And then when you go to the preference question, it assumes that you marked, let's say, green is different, which means red and blue are the same. So it'll ask you to compare green versus blue. And I can't tell you how many people who may or may not have had something to drink earlier say, well, you just gave the answer away. And I'm like, how did I give the answer away? It's like, well, you just told me that these 2 are the 2 different ones. I'm like, no, you chose one as being different. That means the other 2 are the same. Why do I have to explain this every time I do a triangle test? Do you have that experience or no?
Oh yeah, absolutely. And what I tell people is, well, little do you know, because it used to be like when I first developed the survey. Now people are going to be like, how do you do that? I use Skip Logic. It's a very simple survey that's just set up for our purposes. It's why I don't share our survey exactly how it's designed, because it's very specific to what we do. But I'll have people say, well, let's say green is the different one, but then they don't know that, and they pick that red's the different one, and then they go on to compare red and blue, which are identical, and they'll look at me and they're like, well, I know one of these is different, so I know I'm right. And I'm like, well, little do you know, after the fact, I'll tell them, you actually compared the 2 that were different. Did you feel like one was better than the other? And they're always wide-eyed looking at me going, I did. And to me, that on its own is it's why I'm in the profession of psychology that I am. Human perception and the way that we're able to fool ourselves is just so fascinating to me. And I believe we might have published an article years ago on that data alone, on people saying that they have a preference despite the beers being absolutely identical. One person even commented one time, I think you could probably chalk up most people's perception or preference ratings as being for whatever color cup the beer is in, as opposed to the characteristics of said beer, which I think, again, is just fascinating. But returning to this experiment, to me, if we're looking at implications, what this shows is that both sucrose and invert sugar can effectively be used in beer to dry it out, and have a similar impact on things like OG and attenuation and such. But it may very well contribute its own unique flavor characteristics. So sucrose is going to have its own, maybe a little bit lighter flavor than what invert sugar, despite being made with the same exact starting product, table sugar from the same bag in your case. Now, you did use beet sugar. I'm sure some people out there will argue that cane sugar is different, or if you did this or you did that. My understanding is that any disaccharide that you would use to eat, in the food industry, can be inverted, can have those molecules separated through this inversion process, and maybe it always has the impact of creating this perceptibly sweet thing that then comes through in the finished beer. It doesn't, I would not have expected this outcome, but I absolutely was taken aback by it. And I find it fascinating. For me, I'm like you, even though I didn't taste these beers, I'm wont to continue using table sugar. One, because it's so simple and cheap and we always have it on hand. And two, I just don't want to go through the process of making invert sugar all the time. So that's where I'm at with this. Now, you said that you're probably going to be sticking with sucrose as well. I think we're both there. I am curious what people who read this article, who are listening to this episode, think about these findings. We are going to get to some reader comments. The first one comes from the Homebrew Chef, who said, "This makes me wonder if the fact that sugar was produced by boiling sugar beets for a long time, some of which might have already started to rot with lactic bacteria leading to lower pH, ultimately gave rise to an inverted syrup still being used today in the production of Abbey beers." Interesting experiment for sure. This is something that I think is a really interesting, it's conjecture, of course, but that because of those beets back in the day not being, properly handled or whatever, they develop some sort of a bacterial, we'll call it an infection, lactobacillus grows on it. And now, without intention, in the making of the sugar syrup, it becomes inverted because that lactic acid is there.
I think it's a very interesting thing. And if you read, I know the Michael Tonsmeyer has some articles on how to make candy syrup and things like that. And, and I think he said in the article that he asked the importer what's in there, do you add acid or lye or whatever? And they just, oh no, it's just sugar and water. That's all that's used to make these syrups. And so I don't know how factual the importer was with him. Maybe the importer wasn't, totally didn't have all the information. Maybe they do add stuff and just don't put it on the label. But I could totally see this as being potentially a byproduct of maybe they unintentionally or intentionally made invert syrup way back in the day. But it's a very interesting idea. And when we get that time machine and we can go back and try the original triple that Hendrik Verlinden did at Drilinden, we can go back and see what kind of process they're using with the sugar beets as well. So I can't wait for us to invent that time machine, Marshall.
Yeah, good luck. I do think it's a valid extrapolation. It's one way to look at this and go, maybe. And maybe they were using some form of a syrup prior to the crystallization process. Who knows, but I do think it's an interesting thing to think about. Final comment comes from Johannes, who says, "To my knowledge, neither invert sugar nor sucrose is used in Belgian Abbey and Trappist beers. Instead, candy syrup is used. And the main difference between invert sugar and candy syrup is that invert sugar is made of sugar and citric acid, while candy syrup is made of sugar and lye." Now, I'm gonna jump in here real quick. I think it's very keen of Johannes to point out. I looked into it, and while I couldn't find anything about candy syrup not relying on sucrose, apparently some like to blend sucrose with dextrose, but I think it's primarily just sucrose. It is I guess most candy syrup out there, Belgian candy syrup, is made with lye as the catalyst, which is an alkali, rather than, citric acid or any form of acid to be the catalyst to separating those two molecules into their, separate monosaccharides. That said, it is still considered an invert sugar. So I get that there could be just, semantics going on here, but whether you're using an acid or a base, if you're separating, the whole idea behind inversion is that you're cutting up that disaccharide into its two monosaccharide parts. And whether you're using lye or citric acid or whatever else, it's still an invert sugar. So it would be interesting to me, a cool experiment idea here. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, Will, to compare Tripel or something like that made with invert sugar that used an acid to one that used a base, and to see if that contributes. To me, at the very least, that would kind of get at what Johannes is pointing out here.
I think it would be really, really cool to do. My kind of hesitation is sodium hydroxide, also known as lye, is some really wicked stuff. It's not caustic. Something that it's caustic as hell. You need lots of, protective gear. Like citric acid is in my pantry and I have no problem like having it touch my hands and worrying about things. Whereas like lye is kind of scary and I'm not really sure that I want to keep that around the house. Maybe in the name of science, I'll change my mind here in the future. Also there's the rabbit hole of, I used table sugar, right? Well, what happened if we used beet sugar or date sugar or some other, or, dextrose? What happens if we go down that rabbit hole? There's lots of rabbit holes on this. And then the term candy syrup, I get where he's coming from. But that's kind of like a catch-all term to describe a whole lot of things that could describe a whole lot of processes. I know I'm very sure that it means something very specific to, Johannes. But I know that for me, like when you look up how to make candy syrup, you have anything from like the one on the Mad Fermentations website where he doesn't use any catalyst at all. He's just sugar and water and getting it to and a Maillard reaction happening as he makes a syrup to things where, again, they're using lye. Sometimes they're using acid. Sometimes they're using different sugars. So I don't really, this sounds terrible to say, I don't fully understand what candy syrup is in a very specific sense. I know what it is in a broader sense. And I think in a broader sense, it's kind of a catch-all term. So I don't know how else to approach that, but I think there's a lot of avenues we could go down and explore. I do think lye would be an interesting one, but again, lye or sodium hydroxide is some really nasty stuff, and it's really something that, at least with kids in the house of my age, I'm hesitant to have around.
I've used lye for certain applications, and the way I view it is sort of like bleach if you're careful with it. But yeah, with kids around, it can be pretty scary, but. Either way, that does bring us to the end of this episode. I think you and I are both on the same page that we're going to continue using sucrose without issue. And I there's a part of me, I'm not to really focus on the influence that we have on others out there. But boy, I really do feel like some brewers are missing out on things because of ideas that were planted in their heads back in the 2000s, about certain ingredients or methods or whatever it might be. And to me, the use of sugar in beer is one of those. It does not mean that you're a bad brewer. It doesn't mean that you're going to make a crappy beer. In fact, I would argue that some of my best bigger beers have been made with a pretty hefty dose, up to 15 or 20% of table sugar. Use it to make your beer better. It doesn't make you a cheaper brewer. So do you have any final words before we wrap this one up?
Yeah, I'm kind of with you. Just echo the fact that, in the spirit of our Belgian breweries of past, they were just brewing with what was available, not necessarily with what fancy thing that they could, create. And so to me, it's great to know that at least in this experiment, using invert sugar is kind of a lever to potentially, adjust some flavor profiles, and definitely something I'll keep in my tool bag in the future. But again, it's not the end all be all, and we shouldn't get too caught up on different types of sugar per se. And just in the spirit of the actual Belgian breweries out there, let's just use what we have available and what's abundant, and preferably local, so we don't have to waste a bunch of money on shipping.
There you go. And talking about money, table sugar is pretty cheap. All right, don't forget to check out our YouTube channel, The Brülosophy Show, where host Martin Keene covers a bunch of fascinating topics in the world of brewing and beer. And as always, you can read more about the experiment we discussed by clicking the link to the article on brülosophy.com in the description of this episode. The Brülosophy podcast is made possible by the generous support of our sponsors, as well as all of our rad listeners. We seriously could not do this without you. Cheers to everyone who has subscribed and left a review of our show. It makes a huge difference. If you haven't yet, please consider doing so. Head over to brülosophy.com/support to view a list of ways you can easily help us to continue producing this podcast. If you want a reward for your support, visit patreon.com/brülosophy. Thanks again for listening. We'll be back next week with another episode of the Brülosophy podcast. Until then, think beer.
Start off the morning with some hot tea, lemon and honey, cause it soothes my throat. Put some herb in the bowl, yeah, it's homegrown. Ain't gotta go through the middleman.